So how are things being made beautiful for you? A lot of times we can look around and we see that there is not a lot of beauty around us. Now, it's odd because it is springtime, and so flowers are blooming, and we've had some of the best weather ever this week in Tuscaloosa, and it really doesn't look like an apocalyptic wasteland, even as I look out the window right now. But we know that there's a lot of danger, uncertainty in the world around us. And it seems so strange, which is exactly what the season of Lent is like. When the flowers are blooming, when the world seems to be kind of getting back into this fruitfulness sort of thing, we go a little bit more inward. And we begin to contemplate greater things, greater purposes in life. And we begin to submit our sin to God. This is the whole the irony of Lent, really. When we should be celebrating life and rebirth, we begin to dwell on confession and sin and grief and darkness. This virus has caused the entire world to kind of do that. At least the northern hemisphere where we're experiencing spring and stuff. The big question for us is, where is God? Why is this happening? These are a lot of different questions that people are asking. How are you spending your time? A lot of people are spending a lot of time on Netflix and stuff, and I want to share with you some of the top things that I have discovered on Netflix. First of all, just in case you're getting to the end of your list, here's some things you might not have discovered. First of all, if you haven't caught up, Love is Blind, terrible show, but you should watch it because, gosh, man, quarantine isn't as bad as that. That's kind of a disaster. Secondly, you've got to check out Tiger King. I binged it all on Friday. What a trip. You've got to see it. I'm not going to spoil any of it. It's a documentary, but it's so much more than that. So check it out. It's so good. The next thing, I have completed everything with The Witcher. From the show to the video game, get on that. Those are three really great. Those are some things. So anyway, these three things are great things that you can find on Netflix. And if you're into games, The Witcher has a very, very long game that you can play as well. Also on Netflix, or this might have been on Amazon or Hulu, I don't know. You can stream this. If you need some good exposure therapy to what we're experiencing in the world, go check out Contagion. Man, there's something good about just seeing everything play out. It's like, look at this. We're living this right now, just without Gwyneth Paltrow. But like this is our lives. So you might want to check that out as well. And then finally, I'm revisiting The Office right now, and do you remember going to like places? I could stop there, but like The Office, but do you remember going out and being with people? That was a simpler time. Anyway, check out those things if you're bored. One of the things that I've been watching over the last week, I guess, has been Lord of the Rings, which is a solid 9.5 hours of your time. So if you're really looking to kind of spend some time, check out the Lord of the Rings trilogy. At this point, gosh, they are almost 20 years old at this point, which feels so weird. But if you've never seen those, they're great. I want to actually start our message today with with a quote from a specific scene, because I'm sitting there watching this, and I think it's in Fellowship of the Ring, toward the end of it, when two of the characters, a little hobbit guy, a small little fellow named Frodo, who the world is on his shoulders, basically. He's got this huge burden of responsibility. He's speaking to one of his mentors, and this is a wizard named Gandalf. So you might not really care about, fantasy, elves, that sort of thing. Listen to this. This is really, really a poignant moment. Frodo says to his mentor, Gandalf, "I wish the ring had never come to me. I wish none of this had ever happened." And boy, as soon as this fictitious character said that on the screen, I was like, man, that is me. And that is so many of us right now. I wish that this had never happened. Why is this happening? How long is this going to be the reality? Why? And Frodo's mentor, Gandalf, said this to him. "So do all who live to see such times, but that is not for them to decide. All we have to decide is what to do with the time that is given to us." Listen to those words. I wish that this had never come to me. I wish that this had never happened. Well, so does everyone who lives to see times like this. But that's not for us to decide. All we have to decide is what to do with the time that's given to us. And so I ask, what are you doing during this time? Many people, like I said, are trying to ask the question, why? We're trying to figure out how long. But for most of us, those of us who are not scientists or physicians or, working at the CDC, those questions are useless for us. I can spend all of my time trying to come up with answers to that, but it's not going to add or take away a single minute from this quarantine. It's one thing for us to wish that this wasn't the case, and that is a valid thing to be able to say. But I think that God may be saying something different to us during this time. Now, in fact, it reminds me of one of my, at least when I was a teenager, one of my favorite passages of Scripture. Really, it wasn't even a passage. I've used this with you guys so many times. It's Jeremiah 29:11, but I actually think that Jeremiah 29:11 is one of the weaker parts of this passage because the first 10 verses, and really verses 4 through 10, are so powerful, and it makes verse 11 even more powerful. I'm going to read just Jeremiah 29:4 through about 14 to you. Here's what it says. This is what the Lord Almighty, the God of Israel, says to all those I carried into exile, that's you and me, those who have been carried out into exile from Jerusalem to Babylon. So I want you to imagine for a second, whatever your quarantine is, whatever your isolation is, maybe it's at home with parents, maybe it's, you're just stuck in your apartment, wherever it is, that's Babylon for you, okay? That's exile. And here's what God says to the people through Jeremiah. He says, build houses and settle down. Plant gardens and eat what they produce. Marry and have sons and daughters. Find wives for your sons and give your daughters in marriage so that they too may have sons and daughters. Increase there, do not decrease. And also seek the peace and prosperity of the city to which I have carried you into exile. Pray to the Lord your God for it, because if it prospers, you too will prosper. Now, here's what I love about this. This is not a prescriptive verse saying to us, hey, it's quarantine time, go find a wife or a husband, go get pregnant, have lots of it. It is not saying that. So that is not what this, but what it is saying is, buckle up. We're going to be here for a while. And it begins to ask the question, what does hope look like? Does hope look like just wishing and waiting and praying for the day that you are released from exile? Or does it mean asking the question, what does life look like right now? Jeremiah is asking the question, what do we do if God doesn't bring us out right now? In fact, if you go on further, and I only read just a couple verses from this, but toward verse 10 through 12, it begins to say there's going to be about 70 years of this. Now, for us, God, please, don't let it be 70 years, right? But even if it's longer than we ever dreamed, what does life look like for us? Jeremiah is helping the exiles begin to accept the reality that, hey, we wish this didn't happen. We don't know how long it's going to be. But what is the thing that we can do? What does God want to do in us before life goes back to, quote, normal? Jeremiah says, go, build up the city, plant gardens, cultivate, build relationships. And I think that that's the heart for all of us. We all want to go out and do these sort of things, to the point that there is a craze that swept the whole world, really. And it's in the form of a stupid little video game, Animal Crossing, right? I was reading in USA Today yesterday, which is an odd thing to say, saying that this little game that was released like a week ago has sold 1.88 million copies in the first 3 days of its release. This exceeds any other Nintendo Switch game up to date. Why? Because this game is about cultivating gardens, building up towns, having a society and a community in an age of social distancing. This sort of thing is innate in us. It's this idea that we can build a community wherever we are. What I would propose is instead of, or maybe in addition to, what you might be doing online or even through a game like Animal Crossing, how are you building up a life in the midst of this exile, in the midst of this quarantine? So today we return to the Bible looking at the story of Joseph. Joseph didn't want his story to be the way that it ended up. He never wished to be thrown into a pit. He never wanted to be sold into slavery. He certainly never wanted to be thrown in prison, in Egypt no less. And if he were to plot out his life when he was 17 or 18 years old, he never even would have dreamed of wanting to be the right hand of the Pharaoh. And yet he was. No one wishes for hard times, for difficulties. The question is, what do we do in the midst of them? Joseph was dealt a losing hand by life, and more specifically by his brothers who threw him in the pit in the first place. And he played it the best that he could. The question for us today is, how can we do this as well? I think there's three ways that we can do this. I hate to be that preacher that has a 3-point sermon, but here we are, right? There's three ways that I think that Joseph teaches us how to live in kind of God's plan B, C, D, E, whatever it is. How to live faithfully and play a losing hand to the best of our ability. There are lessons in how we act. There's lessons in how we love. And finally, there's lessons in how we think. I want to read from Genesis 41, 56 through 57. And we kind of closed with this last week. It says, when the famine, you remember Joseph was in charge of all the storehouses and all the resources of Egypt for 7 years to prepare for a 7-year famine. It says, when the famine had spread over the whole country, Joseph opened all the storehouses and he sold grain to the Egyptians. For the famine was severe throughout Egypt, and all the world came to Egypt to buy grain from Joseph because the famine was that severe everywhere. Joseph was put in charge of food distribution because he continued to use his gifts to be his truest, God-honoring self during his trial. How did he do this? Well, like we said last week, he simply did the next right thing. To put it another way, when he saw a need, he met a need. When he saw a need, he met that need. When he was in prison, he saw that 2 other prisoners were dejected, so he counseled them. They shared their dreams with one another, and he was able to be there for him. Before that, he worked diligently as a slave. Now, you might say, but slavery is wrong. Absolutely. The Bible does not think that slavery is plan A by any means. But Joseph said, this is my lot in life right now. To the best of my ability, I'm going to serve and I'm going to do what has to be done because I have nothing else to do. He gained favor with his slave master. In every situation, Joseph was able to tap into his truest self so that he could do something that honored God, even though it should have never been that way. The truth is, this challenges me. In the midst of my isolation and my quarantine, how am I meeting needs as I see them? The thing that I've discovered is that I can't meet needs in the world if I'm focused on my own. And that's such a strange thing because we need to care for our own needs, our emotional needs, our physical needs, certainly. But you know what? I'm pretty blessed. I've got everything that I need, more than I need even, as far as food and resources. But I also understand that there are people that are maybe in at-risk demographics that need a lot more than me. So what are we doing to address those needs? Sociological and psychological studies and research shows that the greatest cure for a lot of our own sort of inward spiraling and depression and frustration and anxiety begins to be overcome when we begin to turn our focus outside of ourselves. When we begin to say, what can I do to make a difference? When we begin to do things that make a difference, there's a difference that's also made in our own hearts. For example, a neighbor of mine has been making face masks for people in our neighborhood. Now, I had never met this person, but she was so spurred by some generosity that she had seen online and from others that she began making face masks, and she's put a little container outside her mailbox for neighbors to come and pick them up and to wear them because she doesn't want to spread this virus. But she also understands that people need to get out of the house every now and then. One of our interns, Hannah, she's been making dog toys from old shirts, ripping up shirts and then braiding them together and tying them on at the end. She's made dog toys, and what she mentioned to me is that she's been going to her neighborhood, knowing different households that have dogs. She's putting those dog toys in their mailboxes. That's just a small way of spreading joy. Another Alabama student, Michael Arundel, had started a shopping service for his neighborhood called, I think, Leave It to Us. This was featured on the Today Show. Michael is I think he's a pre-med student here at the University of Alabama, and he started a shopping service in his neighborhood where he and some of his friends began delivering groceries free of charge to people in need in his neighborhood. These are just a few of the ways that we can see a need and address a need. My question is, are you looking for needs in the world around you? Again, I believe that our truest selves are proven and revealed during our times of trials, including a time of quarantine. So based on your actions, how you have acted up to this point in quarantine, I want to ask a tough question, and I ask it of myself as well. Based on what you've done up to this point, who are you, truly? Not who do you aspire to be. Who are you? It's easy to be your best self when everything is going right. But when the world falls apart, who are you? James 2:18 says this, someone will say, you have faith, I have deeds. Well, show me your faith without action, and I'll show you who I am and what I believe by what I do. Your faith, your belief, your aspirations are proven by how you act and who you reveal yourself to be by your behaviors. All right, that's number one. How you act during this time matters. Number two, how you love others. Joseph's story begins to get a little bit more personal for Joseph. The story doesn't end happily ever after once he gets into Pharaoh's palace, right? Instead, it says this. Genesis 42, verses 6 and 8. Now Joseph was the governor of the land, the person who sold grain to all its people. So when Joseph's brothers arrived, remember the brothers who threw him into the pit, the family that completely left him for dead and abandoned him and started him down this hellish, chaotic road in the first place, those guys, they show up. Why? Because they're in need. And they show up at Joseph's doorstep because he's in charge of distributing the food. So it says, when Joseph's brothers arrived, they bowed down to him with their faces to the ground, and although Joseph recognized his brothers, they did not recognize him. For Joseph, the end of this story included revisiting some old grudges, addressing those old grudges, reconciling, and then moving forward together. How is this quarantine, this isolation, this disruption put you in contact with people with whom you might have some grudges? Some of you might be begrudgingly back at home, living with your parents, siblings, people that you were like, man, I just am so glad to go to college to get away from them, and now you find that you're back in the living room with them, sharing space. What's that like? Is there a grudge? Is there resentment? Maybe during this time, God is exposing something in your own heart that is saying it's time to reconcile. It's time to put that to rest. Because before you can get to what I want you to go to, I think God is saying, before you can be who I've eventually got planned for you to be, before you get that position, that opportunity, before you're released from quarantine, I want to mine to the core of your heart and begin to reveal some things that I want to take out of there. We find ourselves back at home in our hometown, back in our core relationships we tried to get out of. And perhaps we're back with the ones who caused us a lot of pain, even grief, maybe even a lot of evil. Because remember, what Joseph's brothers did to him was downright evil. What pain has that brought up for you? I want you to explore that for a second. What pain, frustration, fear do you feel? And how are you dealing with it? For some of us, it causes us to begin to entertain all kinds of temptations when we're put into friction-type situations with family members and loved ones. When we're back in our hometown, we begin to adopt old habits again. How are you dealing with it? Joseph, having lived through a great deal of life on his own at this point, when he sees his brothers, he doesn't immediately say, "Oh, my brothers, I'm so excited to see you." No. He's wary. Why? Because the last time he saw his brothers, what'd they do? They threw him into a pit. We should not jump in wholeheartedly into relationships that could still be damaging. So what did he do? Now, I think this is important. I think that any preacher that simply says, "Hey, you need to forgive this person, forgive, forget, reconcile, and move on," I think that is unhealthy and at worst, dangerous. Joseph doesn't do that. What Joseph does from chapters 42 to 44 of Genesis is he tests his brothers. You can read those chapters on your own to see exactly how he tested them, but he is not foolish. He tests them. A lot of scholars say that he tests them to, quote, determine whether the brothers have changed and are acting to him more like brothers. Are you going to act like family? Or are you still acting like my enemy? This is good. We don't throw our pearls before swine, as Jesus says. We do not reconcile or reunite foolishly. If we're going to be in relationship again, have the ones who once hurt us, disappointed us, changed? And if so, how are they currently since we've been at home? The next thing he did was he released his brothers from guilt or blame. He released them. Joseph said to his brothers, "I am Joseph. Is my father still living?" But his brothers were not able to answer him because they were terrified at his presence. Joseph said to his brothers, "Come close to me." When they had done so, he said, "I am your brother Joseph." He reveals himself to them. "The one you sold into Egypt," which you can imagine they're terrified. "And now do not be distressed. Don't be angry with yourselves for selling me here, because," listen to this, "it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you. For 2 years now there's been a famine in the land, and the next 5 years there will be no more plowing nor reaping. It's going to be a famine still. But God sent me ahead of you to preserve for you a remnant on earth and to save lives by a great deliverance. So then it was not you who sent me here." Listen to this. Joseph was able to release them from guilt and blame because of his perspective. It was not you who sent me here, but it was God. He made me father to Pharaoh, lord of his entire household and ruler over all of Egypt. Which leads us to the very last thing here. Joseph's perspective changed over the course of this. He began to say, okay, from the standpoint of my brothers were in control of my life, what they meant for evil has been the defining factor of my life, to turning to, no, what they meant for evil, God is using for good. So we can blame whoever, whatever foreign leader or U.S. president or officials or whatever. We can blame as many people as we want for this pandemic and for its handling. Or we can begin to say what was meant for evil, carelessness, whatever, God may be turning for something good. Joseph ended up bringing his entire family to Egypt and caring for them, caring for the very ones who had no care for him when he was younger. And it was because, and this is the third thing, God had changed the way that he thought about his situation. Joseph said to them, "You intended to harm me," Genesis 50, "but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. What was meant for evil, God means for good. Doesn't mean God planned it, but God uses it, and God will not waste a trial in life. God will not waste this trial in your life. So do you believe that? Your perspective right now matters. Something my dad always told me when I would be reluctant to wake up in the morning as I was supposed to be getting ready for school. Dad always said to me, "Wake up like you meant to, Wade. Wake up like you meant to." Basically meaning you're waking up as though this was an accident, like you're surprised, like you have to. Wake up with some intention. Are you waking up like you mean to? Are you living like you mean to right now? Because what you do points to your belief in who God is. Do you believe God is still active in your life right now? Don't give up on that, because God hasn't given up on who you are and who you can be at this moment in time and in your life. God wants to redeem us, so make time for God. Amidst Animal Crossing and Netflix and whatever else, take time to focus on what God has for you, because God has things for you right here and right now, because He is good and He is God. Yeah. You may wish that this time had never come to you, that none of this had ever happened. But so do all who live to see such times. That's not for us to decide. All that we have to decide is what to do with the time that is given to us. Let's pray. Jesus, you call us into this time, and we look to you, and we reflect, and we simply ask the question, what would you have us do? We believe that you are still God, that you are still good. So God, would you transform our actions, our relationships? Would you transform our perspective and attitude even? Help us to live faithfully. Help us to have actions and relationships that convey a deep belief in you. That though this is not the way that it should be, that chaos is not the way that it should be in the world, you are still God, you are still good, and you are still leading us. So God, would you lead us now? In your name, Jesus, amen.